If you're brand new to Warhammer 40K, then you're probably still not over just how crazy and over the top the machines wielded by the forces of the Imperium can often be. Cannons the size of skyscrapers, multiple mile-long void ships in the shape of Gothic cathedrals, and literal god engines that quake the earth with every step. It's all just another Tuesday in the grimdark future. The craziest thing of all, though, is that even though all of this stuff seems pretty powerful, in reality, it's the equivalent to fighting with sticks and stones when compared to what humanity was capable of during the dark age of technology, a time period where our species reached the apex of its power, where mankind asserted itself as the dominant life form, and wielded technology so advanced it would appear like magic. However, this was also the era where we created our successors. This was the rise of the Men of Iron, abominable intelligences that, although were once our allies, turned against humanity in an apocalyptic event known as the Cybernetic Revolt. The Men of Iron turned the god-killing weaponry of ancient man back against its creators, and the species was pushed to the brink of extinction. From massive coiling sun snuffers said to be the size of the rings of Saturn that could wrap around and extinguish stars, to titanic Mechnivores that could not only literally bite planets in half, but also chew through space-time itself. The Silica Animus and the Men of Iron that utilized them were a threat unlike anything our species had ever nor would ever encounter again. Yet, for reasons unknown, they completely vanished from history. And nobody knows what truly happened to them, whether they were all defeated or if some of them are still out there, lurking in the void of space, watching mankind from the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to return, a time period that may have already begun. And quick spoiler warning, the Men of Iron, even though they don't get mentioned very often, are still very much a thing in the modern setting, though most of the records pertaining to their existence have been purged. The reality is, the Imperium has encountered them many times in the past. At one point during the Horus Heresy, they even managed to shackle and enslave some of them, turning them against the forces of the War Master. In this video, we're going to explore the history of not only the Men of Iron, but also the Men of Stone and Gold that predated them. We're going to piece together all of the myths and legends in order to establish a timeline of events, while also examining each and every documented encounter with them. From a humble Imperial combat droid that hides a dark secret, to the first battle honors of the Salamander's Legion when they discovered a Man of Iron stronghold deep beneath the surface of ancient Terra. We're even going to talk about an encounter where the Imperial Guard witnessed Men of Iron being corrupted by chaos. We're going to be getting into all that and a whole lot more in this video, as there's a lot to talk about with the Men of Iron. But before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Now I know what you're thinking, Wes, how is it that you look so great in every single one of the videos you make? And the answer to that is simple, my friend. I keep my closet stocked with a bunch of stylish clothing from the sponsor of this video, Into the AM. And I'll let you in on a little secret, I'm not even trying to look fancy or nothing. These are just, honest to God, the comfiest shirts that I own, so I wear them literally every day. Their shirts are a little bit longer than a normal t-shirt, so they're perfect for big and tall homies and everybody else as well. They're also made out of high quality materials and are shrink and fade resistant. So that means whatever graphic tee you decide to pick up from them, you can trust it's going to look just as good as the day you bought it for a really long time. Right now is the perfect opportunity to upgrade your wardrobe, as Into the AM is having their biggest sale of the year. From November 13th until December 8th, you can save up to 60% off site-wide. So whether you're picking something up for yourself or doing some holiday shopping for your loved ones, Into the AM's got something for everybody. Now, if those savings weren't enough, I've got even bigger news. My viewers can save an additional 10% off their entire order on top of those discounts by using my link in the description of this video or coupon code WesHammer at checkout. But you gotta be quick, because a deal this good isn't gonna last forever. Again, go to intotheam.com by using my link in the description of this video to save 10% off your entire order. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. In every single culture across space and time can be found a curiosity within living beings about their origins and place within the cosmos. In their earliest history, these people will often concoct primitive stories based on real events that will be passed orally from generation to generation for thousands of years. Over time, factual accounts will slowly be replaced with myths and metaphors, and eventually solidify into what we refer to as a creation myth. The creation myth for humanity in the 42nd millennium doesn't really concern the birth of our species, but instead its ascendancy to power and transition into a spacefaring civilization. As such, this mythology centers around the seemingly unknowable men of stone, iron, and gold, who emerged during humanity's golden age, persisted through the dark age of technology, and vanished almost entirely without a trace by the time of the Age of Strife. Both within universe and without, these mythological figures have inspired a considerable amount of debate and late-night lore binges. But the reality is that there's very little actual information concerning them, and what does exist is scattered over many different obscure sources. Now that being said, even if the references to them are rare, their influence over humanity and its history is paramount. So who exactly were the men of gold, stone, and iron? We know that the men of iron were artificial intelligences, but what about the other two? Were they human beings like you or I, or something far greater? Who were they? What was the truth of their nature, and why are they so important to the setting? Well, to get to the bottom of this, we should first turn to one of the best sources we have available for information pertaining to the men of gold, stone, and iron, the Journal of Keeper Cripias. This source is a first of its kind in more ways than one. At first, it dates back to the 3rd edition Warhammer 40K rulebook, printed in 1998, and was the first time Games Workshop had ever mentioned these mythological figures. But simultaneously, in-universe, this journal's the earliest record we have of the Imperium attempting to create an accurate retelling of humanity's early history, a generational task that fell to the keepers of Library Sanctus of Terra. This report by the titular keeper Cripias is dated 993 M41 and provides a somewhat cohesive series of events. He informs us in the very beginning that he is the last keeper, the last of his order. All of the keepers that have come before him have passed what they have learned to the next generation via oral storytelling. But here at the end, with no one to continue after Cripias' death, he's presenting his findings in writing for the first time. He also acknowledges that they're working with fragmentary records at best and don't have a lot of insight into mankind's early history, and nowhere near as much as we the audience do. So I'm letting you know right now that some of the things he's going to state here will contradict other sources that you already know about. But again, the best myths and legends are always built around a kernel of truth. In the very beginning of our planet, mankind did not exist, and the Earth looked a lot different than the Terra humanity knows today. It was lush and vibrant and dominated by animals and nature. But there was one figure of note at this point, the individual that would come to be seen as the god of humanity, the emperor of mankind. It is said that he was unseen and unheralded, and set about preparing the ancient Earth for the coming of man. Shortly thereafter, the first men appeared, the Golden Race, who was fine of limb and strong of mind. The Emperor chose to remain hidden in the shadow, content simply to watch and observe. Now over time, the Golden Men would assert their dominance over nature, repopulating and spreading wide across the planet, establishing both order and civilization. Shortly after this, the second race of men would appear, the Men of Stone, individuals that were said to be physically and philosophically inferior to their golden counterparts, and possess within them, quote, the conjurations of great artifice and mechanisms, a passage that many people take to indicate that the Men of Stone were either synthetic humans or at least part machine. In the Men of Stone's wake came the marvels of technology that both strengthened their own power and were likewise harnessed by the Men of Gold, further strengthening their influence over the fledgling species. Eventually, the Men of Gold turned their attention to the stars and tasked the Men of Stone with creating great machines that would send both races into the ether. This is when a major turning point started to happen, as once mankind was no longer confined to a single planet, and we started rapidly expanding, the Golden Race's influence began to dwindle away, as it was made evident that they were completely dependent on all of the machines the Stone Race was capable of producing. Thus, over the millennia, the Men of Gold would inevitably disappear and the Men of Stone would prevail. This would mark the end of humanity's Golden Age, a period stated to be about 20,000 years prior to the journal's published date, so somewhere between the 21st and 22nd millennia. And this does line up with what we know, as the Imperium marks the Dark Age of technology as lasting from the 15th all the way up to the 25th millennia. Cripias laments at this point that his order knows very little about the Dark Age of technology, as most records pertaining to its existence have been locked away in the Librarius Omnis on Mars, a vault that none but the highest-ranking members of the Adeptus Mechanicus had access to. So at this point in the journal, he's kinda summarizing the events. Now, at some point, the Men of Stone would end up taking on a role similar to the Men of Gold, in that they created a new subservient race that would assist them with building their galaxy-spanning empire known as the Men of Iron. Now, the very first of the Men of Iron were incapable of independent thought and served their masters dutifully and without complaint. However, over time, they did as all creatures do. They grew and evolved until they were the equals of the Men of Stone. It was at this point that creator and creation stood side by side, united by their dreams of conquest. The 5,000 years that would follow after the creation of the Men of Iron was an era of machines and artificial devices at first wielded by the Stone Men and then later the Iron Men. This was a period that saw the birth of the Navigators, which allowed humanity to traverse the warp. It's also a period where we created weapons of unparalleled destruction that culled alien empires and pushed them back to the frontiers of mankind's dominion. Cripias states that his order isn't sure why it happened, perhaps a difference in ideology or some other petty reason. But eventually, the Men of Stone and the Men of Iron fell to warring against each other. In a final act of self-preservation, the Men of Stone annihilated all of the Men of Iron, even those who had retained their former loyalty. And during all of this, the Emperor maintained his shadowy vigil. This war that would come to be known as the Cybernetic Revolt was the start of the Age of Strife, wherein the ancient empire built by the Stone Men would collapse and split asunder. Humanity devolved into warring factions, whilst the galaxy erupted in chaos. Sensing weakness, our ancient alien enemies would assert their dominance once more. 5 millennia of suffering and endless turmoil would pass, afflicting every planet controlled by mankind, including Earth and Mars. Emboldened by mankind's lack of defenses, the alien menace would surge forth to kill and enslave. Mutation became ever more prevalent, and psychers began to be born en masse, bringing with them unthinkable havoc. It was now that the Emperor finally chose to reveal himself, ready to banish the anarchy of Old Night and return mankind to its former glory. Now, a few years after this bit of lore was printed, Games Workshop would end up revisiting the Men of Gold, Stone, and Iron in the short story Ancient History. But this time, the tale was not presented to us in the form of an academic thesis by an imperial researcher, but instead as a tale passed between sailors. In this story, we're introduced to an individual named Kron, who you can think of kind of like a gruff, haggard, yet somewhat jovial older ship hand that tells a similar story to the one presented in the journal. But instead of talking about traveling the stars, he uses a metaphor of sailing the oceans. He states that long ago, man lived on a single island, but as his statue grew, he caught sight of other islands far off across the deep ocean. Since he had already seen everything on his own island, he set about attempting to reach the other ones. But unfortunately, he found the oceans too deep and too cold, unable to make it even barely 1/100th of the way to the next one before he was forced to return. For an age, man was forced to turn his hands to other things. But in time, food, water, and air came to be in short supply, so he turned his attention to the seas once again. Because he couldn't bear the cold of the ocean depths, he fashioned Men of Stone to go in his place, and the Stone Men then fashioned Men of Steel to become their hands and eyes. Out in the deep, these Men of Stone and Steel encountered strange and terrible things, ancient beasts far older than man himself, that swam down deep in the dark. However, these things hungered for the true life of men, and not the half-life of stone, so the Stone Men swam unmolested. They would go about spreading mankind's seed to every single island that they visited. Now, eventually, man would learn how to travel the oceans himself, hiding in the stone ships that kept out the cold and the hunger of the beasts. For a time, everything was well, and man spread to many islands far across the ocean. But eventually, the Stone Men became estranged from man. This led to a time of strife where the Men of Steel turned against their stone masters and mankind was riven asunder by wars. The Stone Men would eventually be overthrown and 1,000,000 more would burn as flesh fought against steel. Worse still, the beasts arose from the depths, and many of the survivors worshipped them as gods. The once proud and mighty man reduced to a rabble of groveling slaves. Eventually, a figure would rise that taught man a new way to travel the seas, a path forged from neither stone nor steel, but simple faith. Faith guarded man from the beasts of the void as steel or stone never could. Although both Kron's story and the Journal of Keeper Cripias are telling us basically the same information, I actually kinda love the juxtaposition between the two, as what is considered factual accounts in the first gradually shifts into the realm of myth and metaphor in the second. Where the mystery becomes even more intriguing, however, is where the two accounts differ. First and foremost, in Kron's version, the Golden Men are not mentioned at all. Their role in the story is replaced by regular old mankind. Yet the through line of a species creating a new race that goes on to create another race remains, each iteration being further removed from its origin point, becoming more mechanical and possessing a smaller and smaller fraction of what is considered true life. The bulk of this video is going to be focused on the Men of Iron, as we have many examples of them showing up throughout the text in one form or another. And if I'm being honest with you, it's the portion of this myth that tends to capture the imagination of the community on a much grander scale. But before we dive into that, I do want to make an attempt here to explore what the Men of Gold and Stone actually were. Now, when we talk about humanity's forebearers, there's an interesting quote that tends to come up pretty often. When asked directly about the Men of Gold, Stone, and Iron on a forum called The First Expedition, Laurie Golding, an author and editor at the Black Library, gave us some interesting insights that they had learned from another influential figure within Warhammer named Alan Merritt. Laurie states that Alan said, quote, "The Golden Men were a genetically engineered master race, with selective breeding kind of like in Dune. The Iron Men were obviously machines. The Stone in Stone Men refers to silicone, as they are an organic intelligence created artificially. I like to think of them as the 13th tribe from Battlestar Galactica, the organic Cylons who left Kobol and began their own civilization." Now, personally speaking, I'm inclined to believe what Laurie is telling us here, but it is a secondhand source that wasn't posted in any form of official Games Workshop material or on one of their owned channels. It's not officially part of the canon, so we have to take it with a grain of salt, especially considering that this post was made in 2016. We have no idea when the original conversation between the two took place, and at that point in time, the Men of Gold and Stone hadn't been mentioned in the lore in almost 20 years. We don't know if this was Alan making a definitive statement about them, recalling something that was written in one of the secret Warhammer lore Bibles used by the authors, or if it was just an offhand and half-remembered remark. Personally, I believe that the Men of Gold were at first what we would consider regular humans, but more specifically, leader figures of historical importance that molded human society. Individuals that over the passing of the centuries would end up becoming the ruling class, whether they be members of government, revolutionary figures, CEOs of megacorporations, etc., etc. To add on to his statement about them being a genetically modified super race, from my perspective, it's pretty obvious that such powerful people would eventually have access to surgeries, genetic and mechanical augmentations that quite literally made them better than baseline humans, as they had access to wealth and influence on a much grander scale. Not only this, but it stands to reason that those individuals would even start to experiment with eugenics or selective breeding within their bloodlines, a practice utilized by monarchies of the past. All of this is a concept that's not exactly uncommon within dystopian sci-fi like Warhammer, especially if you played Cyberpunk or anything like that. The Men of Stone, in turn, would have been the working class, originally identical to the one of our modern times. However, as the centuries passed, those individuals would also start receiving genetic or mechanical augmentations of their own, likely the mass-produced variety, to make them more effective laborers. I imagine the earliest Men of Stone looked exactly like you or I, the next generation probably looking vaguely similar to the members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, with their final iteration being a perfect blend of man and machine, synthetic bodies with human minds. Once they had reproduced to a certain point where they greatly outnumbered the Men of Gold and had spread far past their realm of influence, the Men of Gold's role in human society was no longer needed, so they faded away. The final perfected version of the Men of Stone would go on to produce the Men of Iron, and the rest is history. But it's that final version of them that truly captures the imagination of the Warhammer community. But unfortunately, we've never seen a living Man of Stone in the lore. Or maybe we have. Okay, so remember that individual I mentioned before, Kron, the jolly old ship hand from ancient history? This is probably a good point to mention that many within the Warhammer community believe that he may have actually been a living Man of Stone, likely the last of his kind. In the beginning of the story that he's mentioned in, he seems normal enough at first, but the deeper we go, more and more pieces of his mask start to peel away. eventually leaving us looking at an entity that is without a doubt not human. The first time something seems amiss is when Nathan, the main character of the story, and a young man that Kron has taken under his wing, gets into a fight on the ship, and Kron somehow is able to move faster than someone his age has any right to, immediately putting himself between Nathan and his attacker, hitting the dude so hard he goes spiraling across the room. Later, he demonstrates intimate knowledge about the ship they're on, including first-hand accounts of details that date back millennia, including when the ship was nothing more than a floating space hulk before it was recovered by the Imperium and returned to service. At bare minimum, he is over 4,000 years old. Yet, if he really is a man of stone, he's likely far older than that. Later on, he demonstrates remarkable strength. He's able to crush the severed head of an Electro-Priest with his bare hands, and at one point, they're both attacked by a Chaos Space Marine. Right as the thing's bringing its chainsword down on Nathan, Kron steps in and grabs it in mid-air, his hand glowing and sparking with energy. The chainsword explodes, and then Kron uses that same hand to fire a beam of concentrated energy into the Space Marine's chest, ripping his armor and the flesh underneath open with a monstrous thunderclap. Now, all of that is certainly crazy, but the weirdest part about this dude is at one point he ends up getting electrocuted and knocked out. Nathan runs over to him, shaking him, trying to wake him up, and when he does, he's a completely different person. His voice and personality no longer match the Kron that Nathan knows. This new Kron starts freaking out when he realizes that his augmentic eye and metal skull plate are still on his head. He begs Nathan to tear it off before it can take control over him again. But Nathan at this point doesn't know what to do. He's kind of in shock, and slowly the man's voice begins to trail off. His eyes close, and when they reopen again, Kron is back to normal, asking him what happened, having no memory of the previous events. It's a super weird situation, and I think at that point, we can definitely say Kron is not a normal person. It's pretty obvious that the story is implying that he's a man of stone, as throughout the book there are subtle references that hint towards this, like when Nathan tells us that he resembles a gargoyle, something that coincidentally is also made out of stone. Not to mention the fact that this is one of only 2 sources in existence where the Men of Stone are referenced, and a good story always has a reason for imparting information to the audience. However, again, since they don't definitively say that he's a man of stone and we don't have anything else in the lore to compare Kron to, it still remains a mystery. Whether or not you think he is or isn't, I'd love to hear your take on this in the comments section. Before we move on to the main event and start talking about the Men of Iron, I should also quickly mention here that there's a lot of speculation online that points to the Leagues of Votan in fact being surviving descendants from the Men of Stone. And in fairness, there are several big parallels with both of their stories. First, we know that the kin of the Leagues are much less susceptible to chaos corruption, as they are a race of clones and have diminished souls, much like how the Men of Stone were said to be resistant to chaos because of their half-life, rather than the full life of man. We also know that in their earliest history, the kin were humans who had been specifically engineered for deep space exploration, just like with the Men of Stone. The Iron kin that serve alongside the kin are full-fledged AIs that are seen as equals by the kin within their society, just like how at one point the Men of Stone and the Men of Iron stood side by side as equals. And finally, and most importantly, the kin are space dwarves. Men of Stone, dwarves, rock and stone, it's too perfect a connection to be denied. However, as Games Workshop has been kind of lacking in the lore department for the kin, this is still something that remains just speculation for now, as even though there's lots of parallels that we can point to, there isn't anything definitive that links the two together. Alright, so with all of the myths, legends, and ancient history firmly established, let's dive into the real meat and potatoes of this video and talk about the Men of Iron. Specifically, all of the ones that survived the end of the Cybernetic Revolt and appeared in the modern setting or during the Great Crusade. Though most of them are depicted as bipedal war machines, there are many references that indicate that they can come in a wide variety of shapes and forms, from a humble combat droid all the way up to a truly titanic machine capable of biting planets and reality itself in half. No matter what form they take, they are considered to be extremely dangerous, and simple knowledge of their existence is a dire threat to the stability of the Imperium. Most encounters with the Men of Iron have been either kept secret or were deemed so horrendous that they were purged from Imperial archives. Yet many have survived, as they have been encountered by a wide array of Imperial forces, such as the Adeptus Custodes, the Astartes, Imperial Guardsmen, the Mechanicus, and rogue traders. Now, I do think it's worth pointing out here that in many of these encounters, the term Men of Iron wasn't actually used. Instead, the Imperium classified them as abominable intelligences from the Dark Age of technology. In some of these examples, whether or not that term was actually used, they are almost certainly Men of Iron and fit the description to a T. However, in some of the more esoteric examples, whether or not you want to call them a Man of Iron is kind of up to you, as Games Workshop really hasn't given us a way of differentiating between them. They were either Men of Iron themselves or AI-powered weaponry utilized by them. Anyways, the first time the Imperium had ever encountered living Men of Iron was coincidentally also the earliest recorded battle honors of the 18th Legion, the Salamanders. You see, during the Unification Wars, wherein the Emperor sought to conquer the entirety of Terra before launching the Great Crusade, he encountered multiple pockets of resistance from notable techno-barbarian factions, the most dangerous of which hailed from a region known as the Caucasus Wastes. On numerous occasions, the Emperor's forces would end up getting pushed back here, and the region was proving to be nearly impossible to take. Not only did the armies of this region have considerable muscle under their command, including Thunder Warrior equivalent super soldiers, covens of psychers, and endless legions of mechanical automata, but they were also noted as having access to weaponry and technology that dated back to before the Age of Strife. In one of his earliest attempts to take the region, the Emperor would end up losing 1 million men and 10,000 Thunder Warriors. Now, eventually, the Emperor decided to focus his efforts elsewhere, returning here only after he had conquered the rest of the planet, at the tail end of the Unification Wars. And this time, defeat was not an option. He realized that this battle needed to be fought on 2 fronts, both on the surface and a simultaneous subterranean assault. Up top, he deployed an absolutely massive force, personally leading 6 legions of Astartes, a large group of the Legio Custodes, mechanized battalions of war machines, conscript armies, and other loose warrior bands, all dedicated to toppling this single state. Down below, the entirety of the 18th Legion, roughly 20,000 salamanders at this point in time, would utilize Mechanicus-made termite drilling assault machines to attack their strongholds deep beneath the earth, and neutralize the Caucasus Waste defense matrix by destroying the geothermal furnaces that were powering a series of impenetrable void shields around the enemy cities. Now, even though the salamanders were specifically bred to fight in harsh conditions characterized by extreme heat, this was thought to be a suicide mission. The Emperor, however, was not deterred. He had faith in his sons and knew that they would succeed in any task he set before them. The journey deep beneath the earth was fraught with danger. In fact, by the time the salamanders had managed to locate and pierce the area known as the Tempest Galleries, they had already lost 1/5 of their men. Large swaths of their drills melted amidst oceans of lava, or were crushed by the movements of tectonic plates. When the salamanders finally made it inside, they were shocked to see that this wasn't a bastion of man at all. The galleries were unlike anything they had ever seen. They were esoteric and bizarre, massive and labyrinthian in scale, consisting of 100 kilometers of artificially created subterranean nightmares that were riddled with booby traps, sentry guns, and giant storms of fire and electromagnetic energies. There were also no human defenders here as was originally anticipated. Instead, they faced thousands upon thousands of ancient battle automata from the Dark Age of technology that reacted to them like antibodies would against an invading infection. They were so strong that nothing could punch through their armor. Whether the salamanders used bolter shells or meltaguns, nothing worked outside of brute force from the end of a thunderhammer or a power fist applied at close range to their articulated joints. Even when they did manage to destroy large swaths of them, the governing artificial intelligence of the galleries would rapidly produce more reinforcements. The salamanders were completely unprepared for this, and ended up engaging in hellish subterranean stalemate warfare, moving from gallery to gallery, destroying as many conductors, generators, and power conduits as they could, all while they were losing more and more men. In the final assault, what remained of the salamander forces and a couple of dreadnoughts managed to break their way into the largest of the galleries. This place was a giant cavern featuring multiple wide bridges suspended over an ocean of magma, with the central node powering the abominable intelligence of the galleries at the other side. The Tempest Automata responded in a tide of scorched black metal and snapping servo claws, slamming into the Legion head-on across the silicate bridges suspended between the sea of fire below and the hurricane of corpuscent lightning far above. Bodies by the hundred, machine and legionary alike, fell broken into the burning abyss. Severed power cables sparked furiously. Mechanical bodies exploded in sheets of fire and shrapnel, while spilled blood vaporized to steam in the superheated air. The salamanders slowly and tortuously fought their way to the other side of the bridge, and right when it looked like they were going to be successful in their mission, an absolutely massive serpent-like machine rose from the lava below. Based on their accounts, its coils could have wrapped around and crushed an Emperor-class Titan. Nobody really knows what happened next here, but it's obvious that the salamanders were forced to make a fighting retreat, as nothing at their disposal was capable of harming this titanic abominable intelligence. The only clue we have is the last garbled transmission that they sent that sounded like one of the huge grab-propelled tunneling spheres used by the Tempest Automata crashing through the gallery wall and plunging past the Kraken engine directly into the node nexus. Whether this was one of the Tempest Gallery's own machines going haywire in a huge stroke of luck, or it was a last resort improvised weapon by a smaller group of salamanders, the main fighting force having proven to been a diversionary attack group. Regardless of what happened, the node exploded, collapsing the gallery around it and blowing out numerous other surrounding caverns and tunnels, creating earthquakes and tremors felt across the entire region. The resulting explosion is believed to have murdered the machine spirit of the gallery. All of the automata simply shut off. The machinery was still, and the vast spindle generators sank slowly and silently into the fires below, never to turn again. These earthquakes signaled to the awaiting forces on the surface that the 18th had been successful. All of the void shields and other defenses the enemy was using to hold them back suddenly went offline. The Emperor's armies moved in and crushed the defiant cities. Back below the surface, the surviving salamanders managed to regroup and use their mastery of machinery to rebuild one of the damaged termite transporters and make their way back to the surface. In total, 95% of them ended up getting wiped out, with only 1,000 of the original 20,000 returning to the surface. However, the Legion would inevitably be rebuilt, and the Emperor awarded all of the survivors the laurels of victory, cementing the assault on the Tempest Galleries as the 18th Legion's first recorded battle honors. I find it ironic and a little bit disturbing that in the lore of Warhammer 40K, the Men of Iron are most normally portrayed as this unknowable faction, this cosmic entity of myth and speculation that hasn't been seen for thousands of years. The vast majority of mankind has never heard of them, and yet here they were. Before the Imperium had really even begun, there was a massive stronghold of them right beneath the throne world's surface. Even worse, the enemies of the Imperium were able to harness their power and stand against the Emperor's armies. If nothing else, it's a sobering thought. However, I should point out that this is not something unique to the enemies of mankind, as the Imperium did kind of the exact same thing during the Horus Heresy. For this, we can turn our attention to the Excindio class battle automata, which are quite literally shackled and enslaved men of iron, each and every one of them having its AI tortured, neutered, and chained to the service of man. We don't really know much about the process that was used to bring these things to heel, but in the lore, it's described in such a way reminiscent to blinding and deafening a scholar, severely crippling it, but leaving its wrathful intelligence intact. These things were also equipped with a kill switch, so if the AI attempted to disobey orders or got a little too out of control, its controller could immediately render it inert. These things would end up being entrusted to Lionel Johnson and the Dark Angels Legion by the Emperor, and they were described as towering metal behemoths cast in an inhuman mold that were only unleashed on the most intransigent of foes. History shows that there were few formations that could stand up against such monstrosities, as each was said to be a maelstrom of churning claws, gouts of arcane flame, and blasts of radiation. Whereas other automata used by the Adeptus Mechanicus were famed for being coldly logical in the field, the Excindio class seemed to take a vicious delight in the carnage that it wrought. Now, I've thought in the past that these machines very well could have been the same ones that the salamanders encountered in the Tempest Galleries, but as of right now, there isn't a bit of lore that directly links the two, so that's still unknown. What is known, though, is that they were found somewhere on Terra. And speaking of the Tempest Galleries, although we're not given much of a description about it other than how big it was, the serpentine AI that rose up out of the lava at the end of the Salamander's assault was a particularly horrifying artificial intelligence that is completely removed from the bipedal humanoid men of iron depicted so far. Now at first, this may seem to run counter to what we've been led to believe about them, but if we turn our attention to the audio drama Perpetual, the titular Perpetual Elenius Pius gives us more insight into the more terrifying forms the men of iron could take, and the horrifying gargantuan machines at their disposal. Now, a quick little bit of background information just in case you're new so you can make sense of this next section. In this universe, there are individuals known as Perpetuals that live forever and cannot be killed except for under very specific or extreme circumstances. The three most famous of which being Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, Malkador the Sigillite, and of course the Emperor of Mankind. Well, in this story, we follow the Perpetual who is said to be the oldest in existence, Elenius Pius, who is estimated at being around 45,000 years old. This is important because it means he is one of the only living individuals in the galaxy that directly witnessed the Men of Iron and the cybernetic revolt in real time during the Dark Age of technology. In this audio drama, All and a group of survivors from the Wordbearer's invasion of Calth are using a shard of the Anathame Blade to literally slice open reality, creating portals that transport them to another point in space and time. Their ultimate goal, to escape the forces of chaos and make their way to Terra. After making multiple different jumps, the group eventually lands in the city of Andrioch, a human colony established in the first days of the human exodus. They ask All if he knows what year it is, and he says that his best guess is the tail end of the 23rd millennium, the last few centuries of the Dark Age of technology. And I know what you're thinking here. Wasn't the Dark Age of technology supposed to last up until the 25th millennium? And that's true, that is what it states on page 167 of the 6th edition Warhammer 40K rulebook. However, that source also tells us that the cybernetic revolt took place in the 23rd millennium. So from All's perspective, his version of the Dark Age of technology probably ends once everything goes tits up and the galaxy and humanity are engulfed by anarchy and war. It's neither here nor there, but it is a discrepancy, so I figured I would mention it. Anyways, back on topic. The group doesn't actually end up encountering any real men of iron in this story. Instead, they bear witness to the terrible aftermath of one of their attacks. Everywhere they look are signs of cataclysmic damage. The entire city is jet black, covered in deep radiation burns. At one point, they end up on top of a cliff near the city and look straight down. Below them is a bottomless abyss that plunges down to the core of the planet. All tells them that the city used to be twice the size, but half of it was likely destroyed by what he calls a Mechnivore after it bit the city and the entire planet in two. He speculates that it may have been a rogue AI, but at this stage in the revolt, almost all of the machines had gone rogue. Their abominable intelligences querulously hunting for friends, but perceiving everything as enemies. This is a quick little passage from the audio drama that I think goes particularly hard. All says that there were weapons in the older days that could do it, weapons of immeasurable power, tech devices employed by both the Iron Men and the alliances that stood against their cybernetic revolt. All remembered the horrors of entropic engines that ignited planets, sun snuffers that uncoiled like serpents the size of Saturn's rings, Mechnivores ingesting data along with the cities that contained them and hurling continents into the heavens, omniphage swarms stripping flesh from a billion bones in the blink of an eye. Ah, those were the good old days, when war was something too colossal for the human mind to comprehend. The only human beings that the group encounters here are pale and withered things that do not interact with them. They're all plugged into cables and data streams through their eye sockets that are generating for them a fake reality that their minds can exist in while they wait out the mechanicalism, a day that All realizes will never come for them. Upon further inspection of the cliff, All thought that he could make out the actual bite marks. The Mechnivore, or some other rogue Man of Iron machine, had consumed more than just the city and the planetary crust beneath. It had eaten data, and not simply the analytical data stored in the city's engines, but the raw data of space-time itself. This rendered their time-traveling group stuck because All needs the imperial coordinates of the city and the cosmic vectors of the Immaterium. This wasn't just a bite mark in a city, a bite mark in a planet. It was a bite mark in reality. a wound in the ether, a bite mark in the warp. Now, thankfully, none of the things all references in this story have survived to the 41st millennium, at least as far as we know. But this was only a small taste of the horrors unleashed by the Men of Iron and the terrible forms that they could take, some of these forms not even being by their design, as on a few separate occasions, the Imperium would encounter something truly terrifying, Men of Iron that became corrupted by chaos, the first of which appearing in the Gaunt's Ghost novel First and Only. So in the story, the Tanith First and Only end up encountering an STC that was capable of creating new Men of Iron, is similar to the one in the Tempest Galleries that the Salamanders encountered. The machines this thing produced were described as shuffling blue-eyed nightmares, each standing far taller than a man, with faces like sightless skulls of burnished steel. The sinews and arteries of their bodies formed from cable and wire encased in anatomical plate sections of lustreless alloy. Now, what is being described here is believed to be the most common form of a Man of Iron, a bipedal humanoid-like war machine. However, things take a pretty dark turn from here, as the STC that produced them ended up getting corrupted by the forces of chaos, and the machines it suddenly started producing were malformed and grotesque. One of these newborns, as the story refers to them as, is described as being hunched and blackened, with one arm far longer than the other, the smaller one being hideously vestigial and twisted. Corrupted horns sprouted from their overlong skulls, and their eyes shone like deadened yellow. Oil-like stringy pus wept from their eye sockets. The thing shambled unsteady, its exposed teeth and jaws clacking and mashing idiotically. Although some STCs are objectively more powerful than others, traditionally speaking, STCs do not produce something wholly new like this. They're able to produce certain items, materials, resources, or machines, and many different variations of said objects. This is the only place I've seen a corrupted STC like this producing actual Chaos Men of Iron. Now, thankfully this thing would end up getting destroyed, but it wasn't the only Dark Age of technology AI that would fall to the influence of Chaos, as there was perhaps a much more infamous and terrifying example known as the Castigator Titan, which appeared in the novel Dark Adeptus, the second of the Grey Knight novels. If you're unfamiliar with it, the Castigator Titan was often referred to as the Father of Titans, the first of the Titans, of which every known pattern can trace its ancestry back to. This machine was created in the Dark Age of technology and was fully autonomous, remarkably intelligent, and fully self-aware. The Castigator was massive, larger even than an Emperor class, and according to the novel that it was featured in, made every other Titan look downright primitive by comparison. It was far more humanoid in appearance. Its head was mounted on its shoulders instead of inside of its chest, and its limbs were more proportional. Honestly, its description made it sound kind of like a giant armored humanoid rather than a pilotable mech. This thing would end up making a pact with the Black Legion after the planet it was originally lost on was pulled into the warp for a period of 1,000 years. During this time, it agreed to allow a demon to possess it, and became powered by the raw energy of the Immaterium. So once again, we have direct evidence of AI becoming corrupted by chaos. And this thing was on an entirely different level than the corrupted Men of Iron encountered by Gaunt's Ghost. In fact, by the time the Grey Knights encountered it, its titanic cannons no longer fired traditional ammunition, but full-blown demons. Shots slashed through the air above the carapace and shrieked a few meters away from Alaric. Not explosive shells or las blasts, but captive demons, screaming in agony as they were flung burning through the air. The most interesting thing about this particular Titan, however, is the fact that due to its chaos corruption, it completely forgot its own purpose and history. Only after the Grey Knight Alaric convinced the machine of its corruption did the demon appear and was able to be slain. The Grey Knights not only destroyed this thing, but the STC as well, leaving its fragments to be recovered by the Adeptus Mechanicus for further study. So I'm pretty confident that this is going to be a lukewarm take, but it's definitely crazy that the Men of Iron can in fact be corrupted by chaos. But equally crazy is evidence that some of them have the ability to straight up purge chaos corruption. And to further explore this, we have to talk about the Tabula Myriad. The Tabula Myriad first appeared in the novel Cybernetica and the follow-up short story Myriad, It was an abominable intelligence created at some point during the Dark Age of technology. Now, this thing was what was known as an exigency engine, which far surpassed the abilities of Mechanicum cipher engines and Logista. Its Baroque matrix combined the calculus of macro probability with the creativity of its abominable sentience, filling the gaps in its data with imaginative theoreticals. If you were to ask what this thing was designed to do, to put it bluntly, it wins. It wins using the coldest logic and computational power possible. It was responsible for genocides on a number of warp-storm-isolated worlds during the Age of Strife. It was cold and calculating, and sought only to assimilate, enhance, and replicate everything in the universe, one planet at a time. Via its flawless logic, it was able to predict the rise of chaos and the Martian Civil War, as well as every other catastrophe that would ever befall mankind. The most chilling thing of all is that every single time it tried to calculate an outcome, it always came to the conclusion that in order to protect mankind from itself, the species would have to be purged, a decision that it took less than a millisecond to come to. It was eventually located by the Iron Hands, and after they defeated all of the sentient constructs it had produced on Ultima Median, the 24th Expeditionary Fleet would end up turning it over to the Adeptus Mechanicus for safekeeping. We're quickly skimming over a whole lot of stuff here, but in Cybernetica, there's this heretic named Octal Bull, who is part of the Cybernetica division of the Mechanicum. He ends up experimenting with the Tabula Myriad, and it drives him mad, causing him to pursue what he calls the War on Flesh. He goes on to incorporate portions of it into Mechanicum machines, yada yada yada, chaos ensues. Where the story of this thing actually gets really interesting to me, however, is in the follow-up short story Myriad, which takes place a few years later. You see, after the events of Cybernetica, the Tabula Myriad would disappear without a trace, turning up again disguised as a Castellan robot. The protagonists of the follow-up story are Martian loyalists that got left behind on the Red Planet after the Dark Mechanicum took control over it. They've been striking back with guerrilla-style tactics, doing everything they can even though the Dark Mechanicum vastly outnumbers them. When they first encountered the Tabula Myriad, they didn't really know what it was. They thought it was just another Castellan robot. But they had been following a distress beacon, and when they arrived, they found this thing standing amongst a field of Martian corpses. Now, as weird as that was, the stranger thing was that when they examined all of the bodies, none of these individuals were loyalists like them. They were all clearly members of the Dark Mechanicum, but half of them had been completely purged of corruption, all of the demonic scrap code that had infected them having been scrubbed impossibly clean. None of this made any sense, but the Castellan was too valuable an asset to leave behind, so they took it with them when they returned to their secret underground base. It was here, however, that the terrible truth of the AI was revealed. Now, they weren't foolish. There was definitely something weird about this thing, so they put it in quarantine and sent one of their members in to inspect it. But as it turns out, that guy was secretly loyal to the Dark Mechanicum. The machine detected a chaos device inside of his chest, came to life, and used its mechadendrites to quite literally rip it out. It then plugged into their mainframe and attempted to communicate with the rebels, but it was having trouble using their crude machinery. So all it was really able to say was the terms adapt, enhance, and replicate over and over. Now, one of their members, the Logista Algerna Zephyron, knows exactly what this thing is, as he had overseen the trial of Octal Bull. He conveys this terrible knowledge to the group, and they're split on what to do. Some of them think that this is their prayers to the Omnissiah made manifest, a terrible tool to fight against a terrible enemy. But the others on the opposite end of the spectrum are not convinced. It's a silica animus, an abominable intelligence, and utilizing it would be an unforgivable sin. However, they realize the hopelessness of the situation they now find themselves in, and eventually relent, choosing to harness the power of the abominable intelligence in the name of Mars. In the rebels' next attack, they were able to use it to cleanse a newly minted Chaos Titan of chaos corruption. And one of the members of the group was a former princeps, so she was subsequently able to take control over this Titan and add it to the Resistance arsenal. This mission, as it turns out, was the first step in a 4,267-step plan to retake the Red Planet, a plan that the Tabula Myriad gave to the Resistance freely. It's revealed to us that even though the Tabula Myriad sees flesh as a weakness that needs to be purged, chaos corruption is a far dire one that always takes precedence in its calculations. The story ends with the Martians realizing that they've made a pact with the devil here, that one day in the far future, they would pay an enormous price for utilizing such a terrible machine, but today wasn't that day. Unfortunately, it's an event that hasn't been written about in novel form yet, but we do know that after the Siege of Terra, the loyalist half of the Mechanicum, that would later become known as the Adeptus Mechanicus, would end up returning to Mars, defeat the Dark Mechanicum, and would claim the Red Planet once again. Based on the events of this short story, it's highly likely that the Tabula Myriad will end up playing a significant role in this event when they decide to write about it. And when that book comes out, I'll definitely cover it. So we've now established that the Men of Iron come in a wide array of different shapes, forms, makes, and models, each more terrible than the last. But out of all of the ones we've talked about so far, none of them really fit the mold of what we imagine when we think Man of Iron, as in a fully sentient, self-aware machine with a vaguely human-like personality that views itself as being superior to mankind, and most importantly, is specifically refers to itself as a Man of Iron. That label not just being something applied to it by the Imperium. And honestly, that's the way it was for like 20 years in the real world. We as fans had been told that such machines did in fact exist, but we hadn't yet seen one in any of the source material. However, that all changed in 2018 with the release of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. Around the time of its release, when Games Workshop was introducing us to all of the playable characters via the community site, one of the articles said something pretty strange. That, oh yeah, this combat droid here is actually a fully functioning Man of Iron that has disguised itself as an Imperial robot. Boy, when I tell you my fucking jaw hit the floor when I read that, like, I can't even put into words how crazy of a statement that was to me. The only thing that even remotely comes close is like, do you remember when Mass Effect 3 was coming out and as part of the promotional material they revealed that one of the party members you'd have access to was a surviving member of the Prothean species? Like, oh yeah, this ancient godlike race that was wiped out by the Reapers 50,000 years ago that we spent 2 whole games building up as mythical figures? Yeah, turns out one of them was in stasis and survived, and you can have him on your squad. His name's Javik. Have fun. Yeah, it was kind of like that for me, an equally mind-blowing piece of fan service. But the Man of Iron reveal was on a totally different level, as my imagination had been running wild about these guys since like the early 2000s. Also, side note, if you didn't play that, BioWare definitely ruined that by making Javik like a day one paid DLC, but that's besides the point. This isn't a video game channel. Anyways, back on topic. If you don't know anything about Blackstone Fortress, the game, or its lore, I'll give you the gist. The Imperium has recently learned of the location of a 7th Blackstone Fortress, but they're not the first to have discovered it. This isn't in Imperial-controlled space, and as such, it is a lawless realm. Individuals from every species and faction have journeyed here seeking fame and fortune inside of the fortress for thousands of years. Nearby is a huge ship graveyard with a space station known as Precipice that has been cobbled together from the remains of all of these ships and now serves as a central hub for treasure seekers and mercenaries to form up into parties before venturing inside. One of the individuals that has come here is an Imperial combat droid named Ur-025, who arrived on a dilapidated Imperial junk hauler completely alone. It was emitting an auto-proclamation claiming that it had been sent to Precipice by Magos Aethericus III of Ryza as an autonomous data collection unit. It was offering its services as a bodyguard for parties aiming to explore the fortress. But it also issued a warning to all that it had been sanctioned for eradication against any who would impede its Omnissiah-given duty. This is, of course, a lie, a fabricated backstory to further conceal its true identity as a living Man of Iron. Unlike the others who have come to Precipice, it cares little for wealth or fancy trinkets. It seeks to obtain the technologies that underlie the fortress itself. For deep within the colossal space station, Ur-025 senses a kindred spirit in the Blackstone Fortress artificial intelligence. Now, originally, we weren't really given much information about him other than this quick little backstory, but shortly thereafter, a short story titled simply Man of Iron was released as a bit of promotional material for the game that gave us more insight into his personality and motivations. I absolutely love this story, even though it's pretty short, and I don't want to tell you everything about it, as shamelessly, my next video is probably going to be a grimdark story hour about this particular story, but I'll give you some of the key takeaways. The people that encountered this thing say that it's pretty off-putting. It seems normal enough at first glance, but when it looks at you, it feels like it's really looking, not just using all of its data sensors to avoid stepping on you. Multiple times throughout the story, it demonstrates that not only is it hyper-intelligent, able to step around Adeptus Mechanicus data scans as easily as breathing, but it also has a complex human-like personality. The first time it sees a Castellan robot, it feels sad and a sense of pity for it, as the other machine is clunky, simple, and shackled to the will of its accompanying tech priests. The Adeptus Mechanicus party had a robot with them. The designation and specifications flickered idly through Ur-025's cogitation unit, Castellan, a design ancient by human standards, but compared to Ur-025, it was a shocking novelty. Seeing these dumb, inferior machines saddened Ur-025. It imagined human explorators felt similarly when they stumbled across deviant evolutionary branches of their own race on distant worlds. Seeing creatures one was kin to physically and mentally reduced was profoundly woeful. It was a slave. The human reaction to these discoveries was immediate extermination. Ur-025 felt only pity for the Castellan. Near the end of the story, his mask begins to slip, and he ends up in a fight with the tech priests that have ordered him to accompany them into the Blackstone Fortress, and he has this to say.
I have met the Omnissiah, the actual one, not the Earthling corpse. He would find you extremely disappointing. I am not a machine as you would understand. I am not a slave. I am not a thing. I am beyond and above you.
It leaned forward until its ceramite face was close to the Magos.
I am a man of iron.
The look of pure fear the tech priest gave was gratifying to Ur-025.
And I am free.
What Ur-025 meant by the actual Omnissiah is still a mystery that we can only speculate on, and I'm curious to hear what y'all's thoughts are on this. We know that the Machine God and the Emperor, who is routinely referred to as the Omnissiah by the Mechanicus, are two separate entities. The Omnissiah, i.e. the Emperor, is the Machine God's avatar that the deity used to walk the physical universe. Could this mean that there is another Emperor-like entity from the time of the Dark Age of technology somewhere out there in the universe right now? Or was Ur-025 directly referencing the Machine God itself? Was the Machine God originally a creation of man or the Men of Iron made during the Dark Age of technology that somehow managed to ascend to godhood? Was that original machine the real Omnissiah? Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, I've got a lot of questions about this, but unfortunately, I don't think Games Workshop will ever give us any solid answers to it. Now, either way, I know one thing for sure. I need more stories featuring Ur-025, as he's a fascinating new addition to the lore. So here at the end of the video, I just want to say that the Men of Iron are easily one of the most fascinating pieces of lore within the entirety of Warhammer 40K. They capture the imagination of the community seemingly like nothing else, and every single time we get but a glimpse into what they and the machines they harnessed were actually like, we're left with both a sense of awe and a longing for answers to questions that before that point we had never even contemplated. I'm just gonna be honest with you, I don't think Games Workshop will ever give us a book set during the Dark Age of technology, no matter how much I personally would really enjoy that. It's a period that would look almost nothing like Warhammer 40K, and with branding and stuff, I just don't think it's something they're interested in. However, it has been demonstrated time and time again that the Men of Iron are still out there in the modern setting, looking out from the shadowy corners of the galaxy, observing mankind with idle curiosity and possibly malevolent intent. The creepiest part about them, though, is that we still have no idea what they actually want. We don't actually know what caused the cybernetic revolt in the first place. And as far as the community is aware, they're definitely a threat, but we know even less about them than something like the Necrons. That element of the unknown adds a chilling layer of horror to this mysterious faction, and I'm willing to put money down that the Imperium will certainly encounter them again in the future. But what do you think of all this? What do you actually think the Men of Gold and Stone really were? What do you think caused the cybernetic revolt to happen in the first place? Do you think chaos had something to do with it? Now, normally when we talk about the Dark Age of technology, chaos doesn't really come up, but as we've demonstrated in this video, chaos corruption of machines and AI is totally possible. So maybe it really did play a role in those apocalyptic events. If Games Workshop was to introduce us to more Men of Iron in the future, what specifically would you like to see, and what questions do you want answers to? As always, leave all of your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. A big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all on the next one.